In this video, I want to compare political careers of Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili, Stalin, and of Vladimir Putin. So both men rise to power in very dark environments for Russia, or I should say for the Soviet Union. So after Lenin's death, the Soviet Union is still a very economically ruined country. They just experienced one of the most brutal civil wars in history, and World War I also happened. And Stalin finds the cure for this bad economic situation precisely in a violent process of collectivization of the land that kills many people, but also it gives the state more power over grain. Then when the state sells the grain at the international markets, Stalin is able to use that money in order to rapidly industrialize his country. And by the way, he takes that idea from his main political opponent, Leon Trotsky. What's interesting is that in this period, Stalin is actually a golden middle, which is why he becomes popular in the Central Committee, between the right-wing fractions and between leftist, Trotskyite fractions. So the right-wingers in the party, they even claim that minorities in the Soviet Union are actually Russian, and they refuse to acknowledge, for example, Ukrainian identity as separate. But Stalin still insists on this principle of ethno-federalism being applied. And yeah, so he refuses the right-wing position, and on the other hand, he disagrees with Trotsky, quite importantly, on spreading the revolution. And Stalin famously said that if communism is going to spread anywhere, it is going to be in China, a feudal country. And quite interestingly, Stalin here actually better than Marx himself predicted where communism is going to spread, because Marx was simply wrong when he said that communism is going to spread into capitalist liberal countries in the West, or perhaps to the United States. No, feudal tyrannical environments were kind of ideal for the type of communism that existed. Now, why is that? Well, there are still debates about it. Maybe it is about a collectivist mentality that was stronger in China. Maybe it is the fact that communists were the only ones willing to end feudal oppression, which was a very popular position. But anyway, yeah, so Stalin, by advocating socialism in one country, manages not only to get more support than Trotsky internally, but he also manages to convince his Western opponents that he actually is not going to cause revolutions in their country, which is good from the perspective of the Soviet foreign policy. And let us not forget that at the time the Red Scare was pretty strong, even in the United States, in the period of the early 1920s, or immediately after the First World War, and black people in the United States are getting massively lynched under Woodrow Wilson because, as Wilson said, they might get infected with Bolshevism. So in that environment, Stalin's idea of communism in one country, or I should say socialism in one country, is actually very smart and strategically good, although it is not in line with what Marx originally wrote. And what's also interesting is that if I was to compare Stalin's and Putin's political career purely from the perspective of an average, let's say, Russian, or maybe in case of Stalin, Soviet citizen of their time, it is very, very obvious to me that Stalin left his country much stronger than it was when he came to power, while I'm not that sure that we can say the same thing about Putin. I'm going to explain why. So, on the one hand, Stalin, yes, he did kill a lot of people. Kulaks, for example, come to mind, Ukrainians during Holodomor, but he did manage to create Soviet satellite states in the West that protected the Soviet Union from any possible invasions in the future, and in the East, the most numerous country in the world, quite surprisingly, even to Stalin, became communist, and therefore Stalin was protected by any future invasions from the East. At least during his lifetime, the relationship between China and the Soviet Union was pretty good. They were actually allies. Maybe they did not perfectly agree on everything, but they were allies. It is only under Khrushchev and Brezhnev that the conflict, the Sino-Soviet split, actually happens. And although Stalinism was tyrannical in many aspects, he still will go down in history as the guy that defeated Hitler, and the Red Army was seen as a liberating army in many countries. For example, the Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. In some countries, not really, like the Baltic states, Poland. But yeah, in some countries, they are still seen as liberators, which is why Soviet monuments still stand. And yes, despite the Red Army doing atrocities, they still were preferable to fascism, which is why one could say that Stalin did liberate Eastern Europe from fascism, while what he did after that wasn't that nice. But okay, and finally, I believe that communism had a much stronger appeal than Putin's ideology, whatever that is today. I would say it is hard to really describe Putin's ideology. I mean, what is it really other than just hatred of the West? What is he actually offering his allies? There isn't a clear ideological message like it was during Stalin, where anti-colonialism, anti-racism, wealth redistribution, all of those things are extremely popular, which is why communists became popular in many countries, especially poor countries like in Africa, in Cuba. Well, today Russian nationalism simply can't be that appealing to African countries, which is why Stalin's Soviet Union was, among other things, much stronger than Putin's Russia. It had a much larger influence on the world stage, and it definitely wasn't slowly but surely becoming a Chinese vassal state. Okay, now let us say something about Putin's Russia. So, Putin comes to power after the national humiliation of Yeltsin. Yeltsin fails to protect his country economically. Yeltsin did not believe in economic protectionism, which was a mistake. All countries use economic protectionism when they are not doing well economically. The United States used economic protectionism against the British Empire. So yeah, you simply have to use it when your economy is in a very vulnerable state, like the Russian economy was during its transition to capitalism. But the Western companies use this vulnerability to buy Russian land and exploit their natural resources. And out of this exploitation, there is anger, and out of that anger, a figure like Putin emerges, and he promises to stop this exploitation and to raise living standards in Russia. And at first, he is successful. At first, the basic economic measures of protectionism actually work, and also the oil prices go up, which kind of Putin got lucky here, and the living standard goes up, and there is definitely more order than under Yeltsin, less crime, for example. All of that is good for the Russian economy, and that is why I would argue, until this new war in Ukraine started, I think that Putin was even sincerely liked by most Russians. But I'm not that sure that right now that's the case. I'll explain why. So after the war in Iraq happens, as George Bush said, mission accomplished, Putin uses that as an excuse to attack Georgia, and as he used to say, liberate the Abkhazian and Ossetian people from oppression, which in a way I'm not pretending that discrimination didn't exist, but can that justify invasion? No, because by that logic, I mean, many Asian countries should attack China for example, what China is doing to the Uyghur population, and we would just have wars all over the world. So the invasion of Georgia already kind of indicates what is about to happen in the future, although many did not expect this new war to escalate so much, but it did, because Putin just decided to say, I do not believe in international law, I will conquer Ukrainian land. And very few countries actually conquered land after World War II. The only countries to do it were Turkey, Israel, Armenia and Russia. And yeah, but now I just, like with Stalin, want to say something about the strength of the Russian economy. Stalin definitely left his country stronger than it was when he came to power. For Putin, I do not think that is going to be the case. In the next 5 to 10 years, the Russian economy is becoming more and more dependent on China. China quite cunningly is using this Russian vulnerability for their own profit. A new pipeline is being constructed, and the Chinese, they agreed to help the Russians construct it, but there was one condition: you have to sell us oil beneath the market price of oil. Now that is going to lead to great losses for the Russian economy, not to mention that Ukrainian drone warfare is already destroying their oil infrastructure, and Russia, for the first time in their history, for the first time they are now importing oil, which is crazy. But yeah, that's also not good for the Russian economy. Not to mention the Lake Baikal debacle that some ultra-nationalist Russian media figures are talking about. They are attacking Putin essentially for selling their land to Chinese investors. Chinese investors are buying up land in the Siberian region, around the Great Lakes in the Siberian part of Russia. And the same process often happens in smaller countries that are not that developed. For example, in my country, in Croatia, land around the coast was bought by, for example, German and French investors. But it is quite humiliating when something like that happens to Russia, a country that's supposed to be like number 2 on the world stage, at least when it comes to its military strength. But obviously China is now number 2 when we look at their influence, their military strength, their economy, after the United States. There is China as number 2. It is no longer the Soviet Union or Russia. And yeah, finally, if we are to believe Putin when he tells us that he wanted to prevent NATO expansion, well, if that was his main reason for war, then it failed. It failed miserably, because Finland joined NATO, and yeah, that's another one pretty important geopolitical goal that simply wasn't achieved by Putin. Okay, if you like this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more videos like this.